Here I am in, my flak jacket and helmet with these guards, and here's this 17-year-old in his sarong missing a hand and a leg. I could barely focus the camera because my eyes were tearing up, and it was just kind of the barbarity of this war that I'd covered for so long was really bearing down in that moment.
Sitting on a simple straight-back chair, the young man with soulful eyes look straight into the lens. His eyes are so piercing that at first you don't notice the rest of him. But eventually you take it in. His right hand and his left leg have been cut off by the terrorist group al-Shabab. Michelle took that first picture of Ismael in 2010. And over the course of a decade, the story she told about him, how he lost his hand and foot, changed, causing Michelle to ask, what stories are told? Why do we tell them? And who gets to do the telling? All of it went into a feature documentary called The Perfect Story. Michelle, welcome to Crime Story.
Thanks, Kathleen.
Okay, first major disclaimer.
We are friends.
Yes. Yeah, you were one of my best friends. We met in journalism school, and we do tend to spend a lot of time together. So this is going to be an very unbiased or biased interview. And also we've worked together on a number of podcasts. So let's just put that out there that we know each other really, really well.
You got me into podcasting, yes.
That's right. Okay, but let's talk about Ismael then. Tell me, how did you meet him?
So it was in January 2010. And at the time I was working for the Toronto Star. I was a foreign correspondent, and I covered Somalia quite a bit, actually. It was a great time to be a foreign correspondent. We had money that they don't quite have anymore these days. And Somalia was one of the areas I covered, in part because my beat as a national security reporter was looking at things that happened after 9/11. But Somalia was also a really important story for Canadians because outside of Africa, Toronto, or Canada, but Toronto in particular, has the largest diaspora. So I was always completely connected when I went there. I've lost track, but over the years, I think maybe 2 or 3 prime ministers in Somalia were Canadian, the head of the police, the head of the intelligence. So, everybody who came here early in the 90s, there was a very powerful diaspora. A lot of them went back to try and help rebuild the country. And so being a Canadian, working for the Toronto Star really helped me get in and get connections.
And what was going on in Somalia? Why was it such a focus for you?
It was, it has been sort of years of war there. But in particular, around that time, there was a group that was connected to al-Qaeda. And since 9/11, I'd been covering all the al-Qaeda groups and their splinters. So al-Shabab had risen to power during a period of civil war there. And then by that time, when I met Ismael, they had joined forces with al-Qaeda.
You met Ismael. So tell me about how that happened. Who was he? How did you meet him?
Yeah, it was through a contact, actually a Canadian contact, who worked for the justice minister there. And I was on a trip. It was a time when it was very difficult to move around Somalia. So I was essentially embedded. I was with the African Union forces. We had to drive around in these massive armored vehicles called Caspiers. We were in, flak jacket, helmet, and you had to have this security to get around. But a contact of mine who worked for the justice minister said, listen, I have someone I really need you to meet. Can you get over here? So I convinced my escorts that I needed to go do this interview. I remember they were none too pleased because it was getting close to curfew. We couldn't be on the streets late. So they're like, okay, but you don't have long. So we race over there to this area, and I walk in, and there's actually 4 young men, and they're sitting there, and each one is missing a hand and a foot. And they've sought refuge in this government compound. Almost as soon as I got there, the guards are like, okay, we got to go. It was a terrible situation to try and do an interview. So I went over and I started talking with them through a translator. They all spoke Somali. And it was Ismael who came forward. He was the youngest. He was so eager to tell his story. And he couldn't talk fast enough, telling me everything that happened. And then right at the end, as they're screaming, you got to go. I'm like, okay, I need to take a picture. And he did the picture that you spoke about. He just walked over, he grabbed a chair, very naturally, took off his prosthetic hand and foot and folded his legs in such a way and just stared at the camera. And I remember I could barely focus the camera because my eyes were tearing up. And it was just kind of the barbarity of this war that I'd covered for so long was really bearing down in that moment. And it was really difficult. And there was this terrible power imbalance. Here I am in, my flak jacket and helmet with these guards. And here's this 17-year-old in his sarong missing a hand and a leg. And so that's when I met him. I raced out of there. My final image of him is he looked at me and he pointed to a Canadian pin on my bag. And so I was like, wow, you want this pin? Sure. Gave it to him and he dropped it. And my final image was him like trying to find the pin. And anyway, went back in, got back before curfew, went back to Nairobi, wrote the story. And I think by that point I was starting to get a little cynical about foreign reporting. You write these harrowing stories and kind of nothing happens. That you come back and you get that kind of, I think there's a term for it. It's called moral injury when you do these kind of stories that you come back and you start to think, I'm not making a difference. It's not changing anything.
Yeah, I mean, I think we all go through that. I always say like the one time that I felt like I was doing a job that mattered, although of course we all feel like we do it, was actually on 9/11. It was like the first time that I had that feeling of like, oh, this is as important as every other aspect of our society. Was that day.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
And I know you covered it even more intensely than I did. But can we just back up a little bit?
Yeah.
What did you learn about how he lost his arm and his foot?
So the story that he told me, and my contact had told me before, gave me a little bit of a heads up, was that he lived in a Shabab neighborhood. And at that time, the city was completely divided up. And so they came recruiting. They asked him to join. And he told me that he said no. He was in school. He wanted to stay in school. And he didn't want to join the group. And that was a really brave thing to do, because I think we always have this misconception that, the group is wildly popular and everyone believes in the ideology. And sure, that's true to some degree, but a lot of their recruits are just impoverished kids. They live in the neighborhood. It's like the mob, You need to join for protection. You get a cell phone, probably get more money working with them than you would other groups. So it was pretty unusual and brave that he did this. They let him go, he told me, but then they came back for him the next day. And they kidnapped him. They said, you don't defy al-Shabab. They took 3 other boys and they put them in prison for, I think it was about 28 days, harrowing conditions. At the end of that, they pulled him out to a stadium, and one by one, with people looking on, they took off his hand and then his foot, which is just, I've said that story so many times. I've covered his story, but when you think about it and you look at the pictures from that day, which we had, the Associated Press had a photo of the 4 boys standing there before and after. It's pretty hard to believe.
In your movie, he describes what it felt like. And it was interesting to me. I mean, it was hard to listen to. And of course, you have to remind yourself he was 17. But he talks about like electric shocks.
Yeah. And it was really interesting when we did that, because when we did the filming when he talks about that story, it was kind of the most animated and emotional that he's ever been in all the years he told that story. And, he told it to me originally, but then, as we'll probably get into, we kept in touch and his story grew and he told it over and over again. But yeah, in that interview, he says, it was just like when you hit your elbow and, when you get that weird sort of jolt, that's what it felt like. And then I believe he kind of passed out when the foot was taken. But then the crazy thing is that they kept him after that. So first of all, I always think it's amazing that these boys didn't die. But, Shabab actually has doctors. They have medicine. So they kept them alive. They took him back to a safe house. And then what he told me was about 3 months later, he managed to escape. He convinced a cab driver to drop them off. He escaped. And then after he escaped, he made his way to the government, where he found, he found refuge there. And then that's when I met him.
And then talk about reaction. I mean, this story, your Canadian readership reacted in a way that you didn't expect.
I didn't expect, because as I was saying, I had gotten a little cynical. And, I remember covering like the Somali famine once, and it was like thousands of children were dying. It was harrowing. I came back and there was a story about puppies who had been rescued from Puerto Rico the same day. And the Star phones lit up. I mean, I think it was hundreds of people called, and I think I got one call about, and I love dogs. I mean, I read that story, but I got, one call. So I was getting
You adopted a dog.
I adopted a dog from Puerto Rico. Absolutely. But it was, it was hard not to get cynical. But it had a reaction, and it started with the Somali diaspora here. They called me right away. They're like, what can we do? And then other readers chimed in, how can we help? And then it was one person in particular who was a friend of mine, this incredible man who's in the film. He ended up producing the film with me. His name's Sahal Abdulle, same last name, but no relation. And he's a Canadian Somali journalist. He had survived a terrible attack years ago, got PTSD, sort of left journalism. And he called me and he said, I can't save Somalia, but I think I can save Ismael. And he set out to do that. And he did. Like, he unofficially got him out of Mogadishu, smuggled him into Nairobi, unofficially adopted him.
Well, tell me where the story goes from there.
Right. So Sahal said he was going to save him. So he was prepared to have him live with him in Nairobi for as long as it takes. I went back 9 months later when he rescued him, did that story, was there with him in Nairobi. And then I went back to Toronto thinking, okay, well, he'll be there for a while. And it was just 3 months later, I get this call and Sahal's like, are you sitting down? I was like, yes. He's like, we got, refuge for Ismael. I've got the UN to agree, UNHCR to agree. And I was like, that's incredible. Where's he going? It's like, Norway. Because we had hoped he maybe would come to Canada. I'm like, okay, Norway. And he's like, I'm like, where? Oslo? He's like, no, Harstad, Norway. So I'm like pulling up a map. I'm like, that's 200 kilometers north of the Arctic Circle. And he's like, I know. So 3 months after that call, I went with Ismael and Sahal, like 200 kilometers north of the Arctic Circle to this beautiful little town called Harstad. And at that time, it was January. So it was a year after I'd met him. January 2011 is when he went there. And it was the time when there's no light, right? So you can just imagine this culture shock.
Yeah.
This kid who's never seen snow before, never been outside of Mogadishu. I mean, Nairobi was a culture shock for him. To arrive there and just think what happened. But, he thrived. Like, it was an amazing community there. At that time, they had an incredible support system for refugees. They embraced him. He learned Norwegian really quickly, started to join a soccer league. He was in school, finishing his high school. He did really well. And I kept going back and visiting him, sometimes for stories. I had a film that was once in an Oslo Film Festival. He came down and met me, and then we went back. So we developed this relationship over about 10 years where I would update people on his story. And his story grew well beyond the Toronto Star. I mean, New York Times covered it, Guardian. He was a celebrity kind of in Norway. So he just kept telling his story over and over again.
And your relationship with him, you stayed the journalist, but you sort of moved past that, right?
Yeah, it's hard. You have this sometimes. And I used to think you never did that. Like, there was always a very solid line. And because we learned that in journalism school, right? Yeah. I mean, when we were in journalism school way back when, I mean, you were taught that. It was objectivity. And I think it was probably before this case, but this case definitely brought it home that I'm like, no, that doesn't exist. I mean, everybody comes to stories with the lenses that you come, and you have to acknowledge them. But also it's unnatural, especially when you're following someone for so long. And then, of course, later when I ended up doing the documentary, to not have some sort of friendship. So I don't really know the word to describe it. Was it a friendship? It was like I was like a big sister to him. I'm not sure what it was. But we enjoyed each other's company. We would see each other when we could, and yet, I was always still writing stories. I wrote a book, and he was in the book. I dedicated the book to him, and there was always still that relationship, that power imbalance, really, even though we had a friendship.
And then I remember actually quite clearly when things started to kind of shift with him.
Yeah, and
you started to talk about. You just weren't sure what was going on, that he was...
It was when I did the documentary.
Yeah. So you decided with him that you were going to do a documentary about his life.
Right. So he had really wanted to do one. He knew that I was doing documentaries. At that point, I was starting to transition away from the Toronto Star and go independent and get more into filmmaking. So I was like, sure, this is great. We had TVO come on board first and NFB, and they really liked the idea, a little bit of our relationship, which I did not want to do, quite frankly, because I did not want to be a part of the I was like, okay, I can maybe narrate this, but I really don't want to be in it. So I kind of remember having these conversations being like, yeah, it'll be our relationship. And then, as you start filming, I'm like, nah, I'm not going to be in it that much. But yeah, I mean, I remember us talking about it because I would ask your advice, as my friend and as another journalist. I'm like, I feel like every time the camera goes on, he's performing. Because he's so, like, you've met him, right? Mm-hmm. He's so genuine and he's so sweet and he seems so real and he's funny and And a lot of that was coming out on camera, but it was almost like we had a very on-off. So like, okay, the camera's on, now we're filming. And you try not to do that in documentaries, right? You try and be as natural as possible and always. So I knew something was up. We had him in Toronto. We did some filming there. We did some filming in Norway. And then we were building towards him going back to Mogadishu for the first time. And that was always going to be part of the doc, that we would film that trip back. He hadn't been since he fled. First time he'd seen his family in 10 years. And so we knew it was going to be really emotional. It's also very logistically difficult to travel there. So it was really when we got there, after 1 or 2 days of filming, I'm like, something is up. And Sahal, who was also there, there's a point in the film where he's actually saying, he's not telling us something. Like, I don't know what's happening here. And he was really kind of getting angry almost. And you can see it in the film. And I tell you, it was really uncomfortable to put it in because it's awful. I think it makes me look terrible because you see this tension. It's like I'm kind of forcing him to answer questions and he doesn't want to.
Everything about him changed.
Yeah.
You started to see his body language change. His eyes changed. He seemed to sort of be angry at you.
Yeah.
And it was obvious something was happening inside of him. When did you start to kind of think that you knew what it was, or did he give you an indication that, because there was, in the end we find out, and we'll get to that there was a real reason why he was anxious about it. How did that sort of come to be? Tell us that story.
Yeah, I mean, at first I was like, okay, this is just traumatic and this is trauma. And I had spoken to a friend of mine before I left who is a wonderful forensic psychiatrist who works with people with PTSD, works with journalists and I just asking, what should I be careful? I don't want to trigger anything for him. Like, I was letting him very much drive what was happening. Yeah. But he wanted to do, there was never anything that he didn't want to do. So at first I was just like, it's just the trauma of this. But I started to feel guilty in a weird way too. I was like, I think in a way, if I could have stopped the film then I might have, it was feeling really uncomfortable, and it had never felt uncomfortable with him. Like I was making him do something that was hurting him.
I remember you were uncomfortable even before you went to Mogadishu. Because you were uncomfortable with him being there, you were uncomfortable with how long he wanted to stay. Like it was already starting. Like it was, you were unsure as to like how he would do there and how long he wanted to be there.
Well, because we worried he was still at huge risk, because here he was, someone who had defied the Shabab. He's coming back. He's in their face. They still have a presence in Mogadishu, nothing like when he was there before, but there's still attacks. He could have easily been targeted. But it was also a terrible, I talked about the power imbalance. Terrible when you were there because of the way it is there security-wise, and because we were a film crew. We stayed at a fortified hotel where, the UN stays and most foreigners. It's very rare for foreigners at that time anyway to go out in the city. So we went out with armed gunmen. Like you have to have security there. But it was a gross power imbalance because everything we were doing was because we could afford it. And Ismael couldn't afford that, right? But he was with us, and just by nature of that, you're not getting something that's natural because we are changing the situation. So all that felt really gross in a way that it's a reality, unfortunately, with a lot of foreign correspondence and the work you do. But it really felt gross, that trip. I was hugely uncomfortable, and you could tell he was uncomfortable. And we left there that week, and he decided he wanted to stay way longer. And we were paying for him to fly there and back. And he wanted us to change the ticket. And I was like, you're at risk here. Don't. Like, please, listen to your mom. Listen to Sahal. What do I know? But listen to these people who, understand the situation really well. Your mom doesn't want you to stay. Sahal doesn't want you to stay. All the security advisors don't. So we left not really knowing. He was staying on, obviously. We left not knowing what would happen. And then got back to Toronto. And I would get weird texts from him. We were supposed to kind of Skype all the time. Communication started to dwindle. And then he kept saying, can you extend my trip? Can you extend my trip? So I can't remember exactly now how much it was, but I think he was supposed to go for 2 weeks and it ended up being 3 months.
And his mom eventually sends him home.
His mom was like, go home.
Yeah.
At some point, she's like, that was the text we got saying, my mom wants me to go now, so I have to. Can you go? And then the plan was we would meet him in Amsterdam on his connection and then film him going back to Norway. And he sent me a text saying, the film is not happening. You can meet me in Amsterdam, but don't bring cameras. So that's what I did.
And then you find out eventually that he's got something to tell you about his story, his perfect story, as you call the doc.
Yeah, it was in Amsterdam. And he said, we're like, what is happening? We know something's happening. And he, not on camera, because I went with producer Bryn Hughes, and we didn't, honored his wishes, didn't bring the camera. And he just said, I've been living a lie for 10 years. I told you a lie. And I remember I started crying, which is like ridiculously unprofessional and not really like me. But I was just, it was starting to make sense. I was like, oh, I am a part of something that's going to come right now, and poor you. And he didn't give us many details, but he basically said, what I told you 10 years ago wasn't exactly the truth. And I instantly knew, oh, you told me that story, and then you couldn't dial it back. It was like a chain of events, that things that happened. So he went back to Norway. We went back to Toronto. We kind of put the film on hold for a while. And I was so lucky that it was actually a really, really amazing team. Like, documentary filmmaking's not always the nicest business. And at the NFB and TVO, we had this, happened to be all women, this team of like incredibly patient, wonderful producers are like, let's just do what's best for him. Let's wait. And eventually he decided that he would tell the story. And he would tell it on camera, and we'd finish the film, and that's how the film would change. So the film was completely different from what we set out to do. All of a sudden, I was a main character, which I hope to never do again in a film, but it felt disingenuous not to be a part of it. And then he came to Toronto for a really difficult week of filming. I mean, he was kind of angry in ways that I understand. And we did his interview over 2 days. Like, it was hours of him going through his story, telling it, taking breaks. And he basically, I mean, in the end, I really don't feel the lie was very significant, but it clearly had eaten him up for all those years. And what the real story was that he did live in a Shabab neighborhood, but he had been robbing people at a market. He had a gun. He had been with his friends, and Bakara Market's a very famous market in Mogadishu. And he had been there one day, and a Shabab member came up, someone that knew his brother, and said, can I see your gun? And he's like, sure. And he handed him the gun, and he pointed at him and said, okay, you're a thief, and under Sharia law, we punish thieves. So now you're under arrest. So they took him into custody. All that part was true. Obviously, they still did the same barbaric act to him. And then the other part of the story that changed was that when he told me he had escaped, which always was a little bit, like, the story was always a little bit thin on details. I do remember that part being like, but how did you escape, and what happened? Anyway, that part of the story wasn't true. What ended up happening was they held him for 3 months, and then they returned him home with $50 and to his family. And this is the part that amazes me. At 17 years old, he knows that he's a double amputee. He is, has almost no prospects there. So he makes his way to the government. He convinces them, because everybody, like the justice minister, my contact, who is the justice minister's spokesperson, they didn't think that part of the story wouldn't be true. So he seeks refuge there. He convinces them that this is the story. And then I just happen to be in Mogadishu and the one that he tells it to.
I mean, even as a 17-year-old, to realize that he has to tell you a story that is sort of the perfect victim story versus the truth is quite genius of a young man who...
It's astute, right? And this is where we all come into the story, and this is what we tried to do in the film, that it's like, it's not... He understood that we crave those kind of simple stories. And I was embarrassed because I always thought, oh no, I'm a national security reporter who does difficult Guantanamo-based stories and other stories that have nuance, and I don't tell the very simple narratives. But I was drawn to this story because it was a simple narrative. It was a classic young kid hero. But I think generally as a society, we have certain expectations of how people are supposed to behave. And, in Canada here, we've had an influx of Syrian refugees, and we all want the story of the Syrian restaurant owner who is making good of it and now becoming this success. Not the Syrian refugee who's like, it's really difficult here. I have mental health issues and I can't afford this, and et cetera. Like, we want a certain story. And he knew that. He knew that he wouldn't get the same empathy if he told what really happened. And he's probably right. Like, I know I've been asked, would you still write the story? Absolutely. I mean, it's still, what happened to him was barbaric. He was still a way into a larger story about Shabab and what was happening at the time. But would it have generated the same outpouring? I'm not sure it would have. You know, I don't know if his fate would have been changed the same way.
You say you would have told it, but was it your place to tell it? Should it have been somebody else telling that story?
Well, that's the other question that all of this raised. Like, in a way, the story made me rethink what we do as foreign correspondents when we parachute in and out anyway.
Because I remember us really talking about how impossible it would be to fact check so much of what happens there. Not even just him, but everything. And so it does make you wonder, like, who should be the one telling those stories when it's so hard to know what's really going on or what the truth is.
It's such a larger question. I think generally in a larger journalism question. I think generally, you know, in terms of foreign storytelling, what we try and do now is, you know, support local journalists and empower that. And I think since 2010, that has been, so much has changed journalism wise that has become a reality. And that's wonderful, because I'm going to tell a different story than a Somali journalist is. 100%. We're going to have different access. But I don't think it means that you can't have, I hope it doesn't mean that you can't have foreign correspondents going into countries, because the lens that I brought was different in an important way too. I mean, I would bring, what I liked about always being based here and going to various countries is I would work with local journalists that would often really help, like tremendously help in understanding the context. But I also knew what people were looking at here. You know, I knew the Canadian policies and what stories would matter to people and how you could tell them in a way that it would make them care, I hoped, anyway.
Well, and I don't know if he would have gotten refugee status if it had been in a newspaper in another country.
No, but then
the power of the Somali community here. Yeah,
exactly.
And we're saying this quickly and you're talking about it, but this was fraught for you for months and months. I mean, this wasn't an easy thing for you. Even you say, you know, it shifted and I accepted I was going to be part of the story. That was so hard.
It was horrible, because you're really, you know, first of all, you have written something that isn't true. You know, that's the cardinal sin in journalism. So I knew I had to correct the record. That's hard to do. Even though in hindsight, I don't think there was any way that I could have fact checked it differently. And also I think I had a duty of care, as you do when you're in the field, to those who've been traumatized. And it's not my role to go in and interrogate him. Like, why would I think that part of his story wasn't true? But still, you're out there saying, hey, I reported a story. So that was hard. But yeah, just the queasy feeling of all the different things that it brings up in terms of what we do as foreign journalists, what we do as journalists.
And you were worried about the response.
I was worried about the response for a whole bunch of reasons. Like, one, that I worried it would smack of some sort of gross white saviorism, you know, which I always made it clear it wasn't the Toronto Star and it wasn't my reporting. Like, it was the Somali diaspora that did this. But of course, there's that gross feeling, right? I'm still the white director and journalist telling this boy's story.
Yeah.
So that's uncomfortable. But I did worry about the reaction too, that if we didn't tell the story properly, and thankfully this didn't happen, but I was worried what would happen to him. You know, at a time when there's incredible xenophobia, was he going to have his citizenship, his Norwegian citizenship, taken from him? Would people, you know, right-wingers be like, see, all refugees lie? You know, would it give fodder to that? And also at a time when, you know, media is so under fire and cries of fake news, would it give fodder to the fact that, see, they never get it right? So, yeah, I've never disliked a project more. You know, it felt this sort of gross, like, let's get through this. I feel like it's responsible to correct the record. That actually gives you credibility in journalism. He wants to do this. He needs to get this off his chest. But, yeah, I think you remember this. It's like when the film came out, I was like, okay, let's just have a quick screening and then like go away.
Yeah, be done with it.
And be done, yeah.
But the response actually wasn't.
It was lovely.
Yeah.
I know, I was so happy because Yeah, it was great. I mean, we had it at Hot Docs for a couple nights, and it was, sold out theater. It was beautiful crowd. People understood, really thoughtful questions, difficult questions, stuff I think like still working through, but like smart response. A couple tiny instances of what I worried about, the xenophobia and stuff, but very minor. And then nothing came of harm to him, which was the most important.
And I know you don't like to, you're embarrassed by it, but this telling of this was so well done. It was so real and human, and it added to the story in a way that I think if it had been always told in the truth, I'm not sure we would have even gotten as much out of it.
Maybe. Yeah. I mean, I'm not saying this to be like modest, but it really was a film that it's like I was the least important part. Like we had Nick Hector was our editor, and he was incredible. Like it was because I was so involved in it. And then Bryn and others, like it was, and Sahal, of course, like I was so involved in it. I didn't have any perspective to even kind of figure out how to do the film. So it was a heavy lift from everybody on it. But in the end, I think once I finally got over the queasiness, I hate the word important. It sounds so.
Oh, it was an important
but
journalism story to
yeah.
tell. Like it beyond you and
Yeah.
beyond the story, it was an important journalism story to tell because there's lessons to be learned from what happened.
I think you can show it in journalism schools.
I
Like that
think
would
so.
be the ideal. And then just let it spark a discussion, because it brings up all these questions that it took me 20 years into my career to really, face.
Yeah. Has he seen the film?
We watched it online. So it was during COVID at the end. Because otherwise I would have gone to Norway and showed it to him in person. But we watched it together online because, and again, this is a weird journalism thing. Normally you never do this, but we didn't feel comfortable with it, releasing it until he'd seen it. You don't do that. You don't show a subject of film. You certainly on condition of like releasing it, but yeah, we did that.
And what did he think?
He actually really liked it. He did. I mean, we recorded that too. It was all getting very meta. I was like, are we going to include that in there? We didn't in the film, but he was surprised because it's hard. I don't think he always realized it was going to be more about journalism and the question of that than about him. But in the end, he said he liked it, and he was bracing for the reaction as well. He already said, some people are really going to get this, and some people aren't. And I'm like, yeah, you're probably right. And luckily the people who didn't get it was a much smaller group than the people who did. But since then, I offered to bring him here for the screenings, and he didn't want to do any of that. And as far as I know, he hasn't done any interviews on it. And unfortunately, our relationship really kind of severed after that. We stayed in touch, but recently, he at one point, it's like, you know what, every time I talk to you, it just reminds me of this. And that's absolutely fair. So I haven't talked to him now in quite a while.
Sad, but also brave of him to do it, and then brave of him to say, I need to move on.
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally. And he did need to. That identified him for so many years. Yeah.
Okay. Well, Michelle, thanks.
Thank you for having me, Kathleen.